So here we are, different, a little different background today, different set of books really, and the same terrible fluorescent light. Who knew that we would have to be engaged in figuring out what the lighting would be? So I wanted to start with Luke 15, and we've talked Luke 15 before, the parables that Jesus describes, or that Jesus relates. We've done that in the past. We have used Luke 15 as a, the parable of the lost sheep. And we talked about the extravagant love paid by the Father, the shepherd here. And we contrasted that perhaps with John's Gospel, where there are no parables, but instead Jesus says that he is the good shepherd. Similarly, in the second parable, the parable of the lost coin, we see that Jesus indicates a great celebration after that coin has been found. So another extended metaphor with a heavenly kind of meaning. And then finally, we look at the parable of the prodigal. And we looked at this before, where the father is asked to give a share of his property by the younger son. And as he does so, he wastes his money, and being close to death, he decides to go back, and the father is waiting for him. And then the elder son is just really put out by this. And again, the last tag, this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that this cycle of three parables only has a parallel in terms of its content with Matthew 18. And that's only this one, where it talks about the sheep. And I find it really interesting that one has the sticking power. That the one where the lost sheep is the one that gets preserved. I find that to be interesting. I don't really know what to make of it at this point, but it is something I'm thinking about as we move along. Let me take you to, again, we're looking at a couple of these parables that Luke includes that you don't find in very many other places. And I want to show you this parable beginning in 16. Jesus said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. Charges were brought to him, and this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is it that I hear? Give me accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 50. And so you can see that he does that. 100, he makes 80. And then look at verse 8. As his master commended the dishonest manager, because he had acted shrewdly. The children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. What a strange thing, isn't it? I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth. Boy, I bet you people have gone to school on that verse. And then this, whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. Whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If you then have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. So It's interesting to me that there are a couple of things that are embedded here in Luke's gospel that really are strange. The ability of this shrewd manager to get the payoff in some other way, in some reduced way, to try to figure out who he might be welcomed by in the home. The home was the place where people did business. The home was the place where people made contacts. The Domus in Rome, in Greco-Roman world, the Domus was the place of the market, as well as for everything. And the father of the house had absolute power, the patria potestas. So in this instance, I'm not sure if that's exactly what Jesus has in view, but it's interesting that in this case, the boss comes and says to the manager, good on you for figuring out this strategy. Look at one more parable, the rich man and Lazarus, from Luke 16, verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table, even if the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was being tormented. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us. And he said, Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment. And Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets, they should listen to them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to them, that is, Jesus said to them, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead. What a stirring passage this is. Unique to Luke. You can see some of the medical terminology used. He's got sores, he is in agony, and then he dies. He is taken to Abraham. In Judaism, there was a thing that people described as being at Abraham's side, or Abraham's bosom, and it was like a paradise. And so here Jesus he's not interested in cosmology as much as he is telling the story of this rich man and this poor man. So you can't really read this as some kind of a comment that Luke is making about how the afterlife works itself out. Although it's alluring to think this way, the flames on the one part and being at Abraham's side on the other part. So as the parable draws to its conclusion and Lazarus's agony transitions to his blessedness, we think back, right, of the parallel to the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, where Luke adds the word, he deletes the words in spirit and just said, blessed are the poor. Here we have a parable that emphasizes the same thing, and the rich man, who goes unnamed, by the way, where Lazarus, the poor man, receives a name. Here is Luke's theology on display, that God does consider the poor, that God does consider those who have nothing, and that charity matters. And then the last piece is really, as this parable draws to its conclusion, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. I find it interesting that Lazarus is the name selected by Luke, but that Lazarus' resurrection from the dead is not tied in here. You may remember from John's Gospel that Lazarus is the one who's called forth from the tomb. Isn't it interesting that you have a Lazarus in a parable in Luke's Gospel, and the tag, not even if someone is raised from the dead, is the line of teaching that is identified with this parable. Now, that hits at an area of scholarship that we won't be able to cover, at least not in this kind of venue, and that is the way and the forms and the language that gospel language takes, where some of these miracle stories line up with parable stories, and how John uses materials in different ways than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Suffice it to say that this parable carries with it that idea of the burden of the poor and God's validation of the poor. So that's a sampling, really, of Luke's contribution to the parable list. He adds to the story in some significant ways. He adds to the Jesus narrative by talking about the Samaritan village, the Zacchaeus story. Zacchaeus, who was the tax collector, who is too short to see over the crowd, and so he climbs a tree. The trial before Herod is a unique addition to the gospel narrative, to Matthew, to Mark, and we don't find that in the other gospels. Now, what's significant about that to me is not only the appearance of Herod, but also this portends to push forward to Herod Agrippa, before whom Paul will stand under trial. The story of the penitent thief, the one thief who says, hey, Jesus didn't deserve to be here, but we did, and how Jesus looks at that thief and says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And then the last contribution to the story of Jesus is the walk to Emmaus, Luke 24. And this is a compelling story where these two who walk along the road, despondent after Jesus has been crucified, not aware, it seems, or aware that the body is missing, but not aware of the full scope of the resurrection. Jesus shows up in their midst, right between them. And in that conversation, Jesus says some words that are truly incredible. He says, the text says, he explained to them how it was necessary that the Messiah would suffer and die and then be raised from the dead. And he explains it to them by way of allusion to the Old Testament. Wow, wouldn't that be great to participate in that kind of a lesson? So these are additions to the gospel narrative. Luke has an emphasis on the universal gospel and the universality of salvation. That is, salvation opened up beyond the Jews. Matthew's genealogy begins with Abraham, Luke's with Adam. In Luke 3, it continues Matthew's emphasis on Isaiah's prophecy, but continues it from chapter 40, verse 3, all flesh will see the salvation of God. And Luke 19, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. The Samaritans are included in 10:30 through 37 and 17:11 through 19, and the Gentiles are included in chapter 2:32, where Simeon first sees Jesus, the baby. And right here is my cat, and you could see big fluffy orange kitty right here. This is not in the Gospel of Luke, and he is not a willing participant, it seems, but he did jump up here. How about that? That for free and for everybody. Luke's Gospel, there's a preference for the poor. You can read this slide. You could pause the video and read the slide, take the notes that you need to take. The Gospels preach to the poor. Luke 6:20, there's a change from Matthew that we saw in Mary's Magnificat. Amazing terms about revolution, moral, social, and economic. There's social justice issues highlighted in Luke 3:13, 12:13 through 21, and 16:11. The parables turn on ideas of money. We talked about the shrewd manager, and then there are a few more that you can take a look at. And Luke's own sayings about almsgiving are also important about how people give. Luke emphasizes the outcast, the disreputable, and the sinner. These are characteristics that Luke prizes. Luke digs the chicks. You can see Elizabeth and Mary, the widow of Nain, Mary Magdalene, Mary Martha. Again, I'd encourage you to pause here and just take a look at these passages. I'm kind of running out of time on the video. And maybe that's a good place just to start, and I'll come back and emphasize this on Luke's emphasis on women in ministry. Hey, thanks for joining for this part. Stay tuned for the next.